Canadians like to think we're more tolerant, nicer, more welcoming than our American neighbors. The images of racial conflict in the US are prevalent. But when something like that occurs north of the 49th parallel, we're shocked. Should we be? Hello and welcome to Unpublished TV. I'm Ed Hand. The Freedom Convoy is out of downtown Ottawa, but the 3-week occupation is something those residents won't forget. As the collection of truckers made their way across the country, there were rumblings that other groups were using the movement for their own gain. The Confederate and Nazi flags that were seen on the first weekend solidified that view for many. Extremism in Canada has increased 320% over the last 5 years, according to the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Our Unpublished Vote question asked you, do you feel extremism is on the rise in Canada? Yes, no, or unsure? Just over 41% said yes, 56% said no, and 2.5% were unsure. Now, however you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you can still cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. Now, joining us to discuss the rise of extremism in Canada, Barbara Perry is a professor in the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at Ontario Tech University. Andrew Crosby, PhD candidate in sociology at Carleton University, and Amarnath Amarasingham is the assistant professor at the School of Religion at Queen's University, as well as a senior fellow with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Barbara, we'll start off with you. An increase in the activity of extremists when the pandemic started. Why was that? Is just there too much time on their hands?
Well, I mean, it's part of a longer trajectory that really began around 2015, 2016, and there have been different flashpoints, I think, that have really mobilized or given new energy to the movement in the last, 7 years, I guess. But the pandemic really did provide some key focal areas for them to target. One was, of course, drawing on the conspiracy theories and the disinformation about, the origins. So we saw a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of anti-Asian sentiment as well. Conspiracy theories saying, variously that, the Jewish community was responsible for developing COVID so that they could benefit from the sale of the vaccine. Asians, Chinese communities developed it in order to overtake the world. So all of these sorts of pieces of disinformation really circulated and were both, I think, disseminated and consumed by the far right, and heightened their attention to those particular communities. But then, of course, we had the lockdowns and all the other restrictions that also became a target. So that's where we see the anti-statism and the anti-authority narratives associated with the far right really come to the fore, and that, of course, culminated in the convoys and the demonstrations and protests that we saw across the country.
Amar, is some of the extremist messaging getting into the mainstream now?
I think so. I think a lot of the conversation that we thought existed on the fringe, and people like extremism researchers were consuming on platforms like Telegram, BitChute, and some of these alternative platforms, they really started to make their way into the mainstream through fairly larger alternative media platforms like Rebel News or Fox News. And once they started picking up some of this rhetoric, you started, hearing mainstream politicians also pushing some of that stuff. So, Maxime Bernier and so on. So there is a mechanism, much like we saw in the US with QAnon, where, it starts in kind of the dark corners of the internet on 4chan and 8chan, makes its way into minor influencers through YouTube. And then you had Donald Trump asked about it on the debate stage, right? And so things that start sometimes in these kind of minor platforms online or fringe platforms online. Now we have an alternative media sphere which has a pretty good track record of pushing that stuff into the mainstream when they want to.
When you just looking back at the Rebel and the Fox News, when they picked up on the trucker, it seemed to be, more concerned about Canada becoming a communist country or under the thumb of Trudeau and all that, and really that didn't seem to be what the message was from the truckers at the beginning. They seem to have co-opted a message like that, did they not?
There's no real one message that came out of the trucker convoy. I mean, right from the very beginning, the memorandum of understanding was calling for the dissolution of the Canadian government and so on. And so it was always conspiratorial. It was always anti-government or anti-Trudeau government at the very least. And and then you had a mixture of different commentary in there, which is inspired by QAnon and the Three Percenters and other militant movements as well. And so part of the reason I think it kind of stalled and fizzled over time is because their messaging wasn't one thing. They weren't necessarily calling for one thing. In addition to the fact that they were carrying, hang Trudeau signs while they were doing it, kind of makes it difficult for Trudeau to come talk to you. And so I think the messaging was always quite eclectic from the very beginning, which, as we know from previous social movements, I mean, that's a good way to make sure that you don't really gain any positive mainstream attention.
Andrew, it seems when it comes to the extremists and the far right, immigration seems to be spurring them on the most, is it not?
Yeah, yes, for sure. I think that part of the trajectory that Barb identified with the rise of right-wing extremism and the kind of increase that we see along with statistics and hate crimes, for example, can be taken within kind of broader context, including within the war on terror, Islamophobia at large is spreading in the Western world and in Canada, and with kind of some of the fallout of the war on terrorism and increase in international migration and refugees. I think we've seen a real proliferation of kind of far right mobilizations, against refugee populations, against kind of irregular border crossings, for example, and around this kind of other trend in far right activity around kind of preserving the nation, preserving Canada. So yeah, I think that immigration has been one of the drivers of this types of mobilizations.
Barbara, we hear right-wing extremism, we hear left-wing extremism. Are they basically the same thing, or are they two different approaches?
Well, I mean, they're two ends of a political spectrum, and we think about the far left as being, progressive in orientation and committed to social justice initiatives, that sort of thing, often pushing back against their counterparts on the far right. So groups like or movements like Antifa, for example, wouldn't exist. Anti-fascist movement wouldn't exist without the fascists who are on the far right, which tends to be much more conservative and often reactionary in orientation and pushing back against the right's advances and the move toward inclusivity, whether that's in terms of immigration policy or in terms of human rights or civil rights policies. So they really are typically sort of at other ends of the spectrum. Doesn't mean that they don't necessarily have points of convergence. So there is often an anti-authority element on both ends. Reactions against an intrusive state, for example. Or one of the things that we've been looking at in a study we're just finishing on anti-Semitism is that, in fact, there's also anti-Semitism that comes from the left and the right. So interesting that there are those points of convergence, but many more points of divergence, rather.
Amara, I'm wondering when it comes to the extremists, what fuels their movement? What fuels them? Is it anger? Is it money? Why are they just the way they are?
I mean, many things. I think part of it is this kind of broad grievance, and it depends what extremist group you're talking about. And so, if we're talking about the convoy, which I've largely come to see as a kind of right-wing populist movement or a populist movement in general, they're driven by populist sentiments, right? And so the elite is evil. Our kind of institutions of government, like the media and public health officials, politicians, have sinister motives behind what they're doing. Nothing is what you see, and they purport to kind of speak for quote unquote the people, right? The kind of true engines of the Canadian economy, the true Canadians. And so they're seen as kind of representatives of those true Canadians. And so I think that's largely what's driving the convoy and similar movements like that. Because after 4 years or 3 years of the pandemic, having lost a lot of their small businesses, a few of them said, they have friends and family who've committed suicide, and so there was a general, I would say, genuine grievance and kind of exhaustion with the pandemic. That is why this message resonated when it did, right, and why it kind of grew to the extent that it did. It was absolutely organized by right-wing elements in the country, like Pat King and Jeremy McKenzie and company, who for a long time have been, you were asking about immigration earlier. I mean, they for a long time have been going on about white displacement and white genocide and great replacement theories and things like that. Basically, since I would say the Syrian conflict and the Syrian migration into Canada and parts of Europe. And so they've been part of that kind of right-wing milieu for a long time. But this time, what they said actually resonated a little bit more, because there was already this kind of nationwide exhaustion with the pandemic and the lockdowns. And so they were able to kind of, tap into those kinds of sentiments.
Andrew, populism is something Amar brought up, and it's something we've been hearing quite a bit about, let's say, the last few years in terms of politics. Is it the same as extremism? And if not, what is, or what are the differences between populism and extremism?
I think Amar is absolutely right. We have to kind of look at the leadership, the so-called leaders, and those have been identified as spokespeople of this movement. And I think kind of where their political allegiances lie and their ideologies lie. So I would kind of separate that out a bit. I think that these types of actors have kind of capitalized on kind of rising sentiment and fatigue associated with the pandemic and restrictions and vaccines and lockdowns and items like that. So I think that while there is this kind of sentiment that we could associate with right-wing politics and even far-right politics, and this kind of distaste and disdain for what's viewed as elites kind of dictating kind of limitations on freedom or whatnot. But I think that we really have to see who's kind of driving this movement and even make comparisons with the 2019 United We Roll convoy and how that didn't kind of latch on to the public and was as vast as this so-called freedom convoy. So I would just point toward that.
Barbara, police and military seem to be drawn to the, some of the extremist movements. Are they being targeted, or are they just a receptive audience?
Well, I think just like the movement exploits other elements of society and sort of brings them into their fold as they see fit in terms of what they can do, what advantage there is there. I think that's the case with the military and law enforcement personnel as well. I should say it actually goes both ways, because we think about groups like LeMut, for example, a fairly large group out of Quebec that was founded by two former military personnel. So they were looking for, some sort of structure, some sort of entity that mirrored what they were accustomed to in the military. So that was something, they were drawn to the movement. But we're also seeing very concentrated efforts to recruit folks from military and law enforcement because of the skills and the capacities that they are thought to bring into the movement in terms of training, in terms of leadership, in terms of, I think, even, sort of lending some credibility, if you will, to the movement. They see them as, because they were an arm of the state, therefore their presence within the movement, is significant and says something about the validity of their claims as they would see it. So absolutely, they've been targeted. But there's also, we see a number of platforms, social media platforms from among law enforcement and military personnel that also mimic some of these ideologies, some of these kinds of narratives. So I think that there is some sympathy, if you will, out there amongst some elements of those two professions that make them more vulnerable and that bring them to the movement without necessarily having to be recruited.
And what concern does that, bring to you when you've got, police and military either seeming to accept the message or at least being targeted?
Well, I think there are a whole array of concerns there. I think one, for many, it actually contributes to this broader, sense of distrust of law enforcement. I mean, we saw that during the convoy so blatant, so obviously, where Indigenous and Black communities in particular were very critical of the way that the convoy was or was not managed or resisted by law enforcement. So they see that as part of the double standard. So it reinforces that. I think it also, has the potential for an accelerated risk, an elevated risk, because they do come with expertise in weaponry, in particular, as we saw with Patrick Matthews, with expertise in explosives. Are those the kinds of people that we want with these kinds of fringe narratives? I mean, I talk about the Holy Trinity, right? They're heavily armed very often, folks in these in the far right groups, and some of those personnel who come to them. They're trained to know how to use them strategically as well as in practical terms. And then you add in these very dangerous narratives, whether it's xenophobia, anti-immigrant, or anti-status. And we certainly saw that at Coots, when we saw the stash of weapons that was seized from Diagolon, for example.
Just quickly,
sure.
What's interesting here as well. I mean, I spent a lot of time, unfortunately, watching a lot of the live streams from these protests, and one of the things that was clear to me was this kind of populist sentiment, right? Is because they believed truly that the police, once kind of woken up to this, were going to be on their side, right? They were going to, the police were going to be on their side against the politicians, against all this misinformation coming from the mainstream media and so on. And so there was a genuine shock, especially once police started moving in Ottawa, that this was even happening, right? They couldn't believe that they themselves were somehow the object of law enforcement attention in this way. It was just like mind blowing to them. And so I think that came not only from kind of the white privilege aspect of it, but also the kind of populist sentiment is that once we've woken up Canadian society to this, the police and the military are going to help us to kind of change course, right? And when that didn't happen, I remember watching these live streams where people were literally yelling at the police, we love you, we support you, and how could you do this to us? And it was just this kind of disbelief that the police who they supported were actually turning on them in this way.
I wonder, Amar, is right-wing extremism the same as terrorism?
Extremism is not the same as terrorism. So extremism is extremism of any kind is largely a kind of us versus them framework. Where J.M. Berger, I think, wrote a book called Extremism, which has the best definition I've seen so far, which is the idea that my in-group survival is very much tied to me taking an aggressive, sometimes violent stance against the outgroup, right? So this idea that my people are embattled, my people are in danger, and therefore I have to do something to kind of protect my in-group against some sort of threatening outgroup. So once you get to that sort of mindset, you're kind of in the extremism space. That doesn't mean you're going to get up out of your seat and actually launch an attack or blow up something, but you are kind of in extremist kind of thinking, right? This kind of stark us versus them thinking that your in-group is in danger somehow. With the convoy, it was interesting in that sense because for them, it wasn't necessarily, they didn't frame it, at least aside from some of the organizers, around these racial dynamics or anything like that. It was more so us true Canadians are going to wake up a sleeping masses that has had the wool pulled over their eyes about the true nature of the vaccine, the true nature of the virus, and all of these things, right? And so there was the us versus them was more like the true Canadians versus the sinister elitist cabal that's really trying to keep the majority of Canadians asleep. And so it was framed in an interesting dynamic, which is again part and parcel of populist thinking.
Andrew, labeling these groups as terrorist organizations, as the government did with the Proud Boys, what could go wrong with that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and different groups and people have raised concern about the kind of terror watch list and these types of labels. I think it speaks to also how national security and policing institutions kind of categorize and track, what we've identified here as right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism, and oftentimes conflating them. When we kind of look at some of their internal reports, we can see how what they now lump in as ideologically motivated violent extremism, how they kind of conflate far right and what we call far left. And a point that I just like to make on that is, when we talk about right-wing extremism, we're talking about violent movements, launching attacks, killing people, using violence, and we're talking about the far left that may be associated with environmental movements, for example, or ultra-globalization movements or black bloc types of things. These are usually targeting property destruction, civil disobedience, stuff like that. So I think it's important to make that distinction and be wary of when the government places groups on watch lists as well.
Barbara, Andrew brought this up, religious versus ideological views. And it seems when it comes to extremism, it's shifting from one to the other, is it not?
Well, I think in terms of the recognition, we're seeing a growing awareness of right-wing extremism or ideologically motivated as opposed to religiously motivated extremism. I think in the Canadian context, even the risk, the threat, has typically been from far right, from, again, ideologically motivated, not religiously motivated. So in our first study of the far right movement in Canada, we identified well over 100 incidents between 1980 and about 2014 of violence associated with the right-wing extremists. And that's at same period of time, covers that period of time when there was so much focus on Islamist-inspired extremism. Yet during that period of time, we found no more than 10 incidents of Islamist-inspired extremism. So I think the threat has not changed. I think the way we've defined it has changed, and I think that our attention, sort of what's on the radar now, has shifted subtly. So that from 2000, from the events of 9/11 onwards, the focus has been on Islamist-inspired extremism, some Tamil extremism. If you look at go back to the terrorist list, for example, it's only been really in the last 3 or 4 years that law enforcement and intelligence and federal agencies have really started to pay attention to the far right. They could hardly help but, given that we've had over 24 homicides in mass murders alone associated with the far right.
Amar, when you look at right-wing extremism, it just seems the movement wants to disrupt society for whatever reason. What does it get out of the chaos?
A lot of, especially these days, a lot of right-wing extremist groups also adopt what's known as kind of accelerationist thinking, right? And so that basically means the kind of time for politics is over. The time for kind of organic change in society is over. We basically have to kind of etch-a-sketch society, erase everything and start from scratch, right? And so this kind of, and so they really enjoy groups like Order of the Nine Angles, Atomoff Division, the Base, the latter two kind of listed terrorist entities in Canada as well, want to kind of push the existing divisions in society to their extremes, right? And so whether it's left versus right, whether it's white versus ethnic minorities, whatever polarized conversation we're having in Canada, they want to accelerate or push those to the breaking point. And so that might mean, cheering on violence, cheering on things like school shootings, cheering on, especially in the US, you have a lot of gun-related conversations around the very debate about the Second Amendment is already polarized. And so finding those kind of cleavages in society and pushing them to their breaking point, right? And so a lot of these movements, accelerationist movements, have that as a stated goal, right? They want to kind of collapse society and see what comes next, or which is largely a white ethno-state of some sort. So I wouldn't say not all far-right groups are accelerationists, but all accelerationist groups are far-right. and so there's a kind of particular strand of right-wing extremist groups which are now, I would say, quite dangerous, because they are kind of pushing sometimes infiltration tactics in other groups, right? And so they're pushing, go into the incel community, for example, online, or go into Antifa groups online, which are kind of ideologically disparate. Go in, find the vulnerable kids who are on the verge of violence and try to push them over, right? And so kind of very active, purposeful infiltration tactics are also going on from accelerationist groups, which is quite worrying.
Andrew, and Amara touched a bit on it. Who do you think is the most susceptible to the message from extremists?
Well, I think what the so-called Freedom Convoy has shown, that there's probably a larger segment of the population that's susceptible than we would have liked to believe. I'm not convinced that everyone that's participated in the demonstrations in Ottawa and elsewhere, waving Canadian and Quebec flags and whatnot, are susceptible, but there seems to be an acceptance that there's elements of this group that are pushing this types of message. So I think they found a real home in this type of mobilization. So I think they are looking for vulnerable people, but they're also looking for disaffected, kind of regular, fed up Canadians. But I think it's types of Canadians that are already leaning towards a certain political bent and come into it with a certain set of circumstances and thoughts already.
Andrew, that sounds like something we might have heard about 10 years ago, when we used to hear about Canadian kids going over to join ISIS and go to fight in Syria. Barbara, I'm wondering, in terms of the right-wing ideology and right-wing extremism, how do you counter it?
Well, you've asked the easy question now, haven't you? My response to that is always, there's no silver bullet. There's no one way to pursue this. That we really need to engage in multi-sectoral approaches and approaches from different levels of society. So obviously, the government has a role to play here. Enforcing the legislation we have before we think about new legislation. But I also think that the government, federal and provincial, even municipal, have important roles to play in supporting civil society organizations who are working, whether it's at the national level or at the local level, which is often more important, right, to address the concerns and the grievances that we've referred to here in the most immediate way possible. So, supporting those civil society organizations who are developing counter-narrative programs, who are developing safe gaming programs, for example, or critical digital literacy programs. I think that is crucially important as well. And then, of course, the third sector, the private sector, and especially the big tech companies, social media companies. We need to continue to push there. They have been dragging their feet with dire consequences and deadly consequences as well. So we need to bring more pressure to bear as a public, as users, as consumers of what they're selling, but also from a regulatory perspective. So again, multiple layers working congruently.
Well, folks, a great discussion, and I want to thank you for joining us today. Our guests on Unpublished TV, Barbara Perry, professor in the Faculty of Social Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University, Andrew Crosby, PhD candidate in sociology at Carleton University, and Amarnath Amarasingham, assistant professor at the School of Religion at Queen's University, as well as senior fellow with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. Coming up on the podcast on Friday, the latest on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the response from the West. Thanks for watching Unpublished TV. Stay safe. I'm Ed Hand.